welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into the world of misinformation. How it spreads, why it gets us, and what we can even do about it. You've given us some fascinating stuff to look at. Excerpts from Kaylin O'Connor's book, The Misinformation Age, some internal tobacco industry documents, and even some news reports on things happening today.
I think we've got a great mix here.
So get ready, because we're going to uncover some pretty surprising facts about how our social networks can shape what we believe. And we'll even learn about this mythical creature called the vegetable lamb.
The vegetable lamb. Such a great example of how even smart people can fall for misinformation, especially if it comes from, sources they trust.
Right.
It goes to show that humans aren't always the perfectly logical beings that we like to think we are.
Yeah, who wouldn't want to believe in a lamb that grows on a plant? But O'Connor's book really pushes back against this idea that humans are perfectly rational. If we were, wouldn't we all just carefully weigh the evidence and then, arrive at the truth?
Well, the problem is we're social creatures. We're constantly exchanging information and influencing each other's beliefs, which, isn't always a bad thing, but it does mean we're susceptible to biases and social pressure, even when it comes to, scientific facts.
So even scientists aren't immune. I mean, they're supposed to be the experts.
Absolutely not. The history of science is full of examples where really groundbreaking ideas were initially rejected simply because they went against what most people believed at the time. Take Ignaz Semmelweis, for example.
Semmelweis.
He figured out that hand washing, something we take for granted now, could drastically reduce deaths from childbirth fever.
Wow.
But his ideas were met with resistance for years.
So it's not just about the evidence itself, but also about, who's presenting it and how it fits into our existing social networks.
Exactly. And the structure of those networks, well, it really matters. Think about social media influencers with millions of followers. That's like a star network where one voice has, amplified power. Then you've got echo chambers where everyone shares similar views and dissented opinions are rarely heard. Those are like clumpy networks. And they can make it really hard to break free from misinformation.
Yeah, it's like we're all trapped in our own little information bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we think we're being critical, we're still being influenced by the people around us, both online and offline. And that's where things like conformity bias come in, right? The tendency to just align our beliefs with our group, even if it means ignoring the evidence.
Exactly. It's a natural human tendency, and it can be really, really powerful, especially when we're dealing with complex issues where, the truth is hard to figure out.
Right.
This also shows how important it is to diversify our networks and seek out different perspectives. We need to be exposed to information that challenges our beliefs, not just stuff that confirms them.
Okay, so we've established that humans aren't perfect logicians, and that social networks can lead us astray. But then you add in deliberate attempts to manipulate us with propaganda, like what we see in these tobacco industry documents. That's like a whole other level of complexity.
It is. Those documents are, they're chilling. The tobacco strategy, as it's called, is like a playbook for how to manipulate public perception. It's not just about outright lies. It's about creating confusion and doubt.
So instead of saying smoking is harmless, they focused on creating uncertainty about the link between smoking and cancer.
Exactly. They funded research that would downplay the risks, selectively shared data, and even leveraged the reputations of scientists to give their claims an air of legitimacy. It's a strategy that's been used time and time again by industries looking to, protect their interests.
That's unsettling to think that these tactics are still being used today. And not just in the corporate world, but in politics, media, and even our personal relationships. It makes you wonder how much of what we believe is actually based on facts and how much is just, the result of manipulation.
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one we'll be exploring throughout this whole deep dive. The key is to develop a critical mindset, to be aware of the forces that are shaping our beliefs, and to be willing to question everything, even our own assumptions.
So it's not about becoming cynical or distrusting everything we hear, but about being more mindful and discerning in how we process information.
Exactly. And that brings us to the role of the media, which can often unintentionally contribute to the spread of misinformation.
Yeah, like that whole fairness doctrine thing. Sounds good in theory, give both sides of the story.
Yeah.
But what happens when one side is promoting outright falsehoods? It creates a false equivalency and gives legitimacy to ideas that should just be debunked.
Right. And then you have the novelty bias, where journalists are drawn to, sensational stories, even if they lack evidence or go against the scientific consensus. Think about how often you see headlines like, "Study shows coffee causes cancer," even though most research shows the opposite. It's about grabbing attention, even if it means distorting the truth.
So even sources we generally consider reliable can be problematic, especially when they prioritize sensationalism over accuracy. It's not just about deliberate deception. It's about the way information is framed and the narratives that are being pushed.
Exactly. And this is where things get even trickier. It's not always about outright lies, but about subtle manipulations of context, selective sharing of data, and using emotional appeals to bypass our critical thinking skills.
So it's a multi-layered problem with no easy answers. But are there things we can do on an individual level to become more resilient to misinformation? It feels like we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
Absolutely. The first step is awareness. We need to recognize that we're all vulnerable to these tactics. None of us are immune. From there, it's about developing those critical thinking skills we keep talking about, learning to evaluate sources, and being willing to consider different perspectives.
It sounds like a lot of work, but I guess it's worth it if it means avoiding being misled and manipulated.
It is work, but it's also incredibly empowering. The more discerning you become as a consumer of information, the more control you have over your own beliefs and actions.
So it's not about becoming a cynic, but about being an active and engaged participant in the information landscape.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of our own beliefs and being willing to question, learn, and evolve.
Well said. Now let's get into some specific examples of misinformation campaigns that have had a real impact, starting with that infamous tobacco strategy. Those documents are like a masterclass in deception, and they reveal a lot about how powerful interests can manipulate public perception.
The tobacco industry really set the standard for how to spread doubt and confusion. Back in the 1950s, when evidence linking smoking to lung cancer was mounting, they formed the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, or TRC.
So it was like their own in-house research group. Did they just fabricate data to support their claims?
It was more insidious than that. The TRC funded research that was likely to produce, results favorable to the industry, while burying studies that, highlighted the dangers of smoking. It's a tactic we call biased research funding, and it's still used today to manipulate public perception.
So they were controlling the narrative by controlling the research.
Yeah.
That's pretty clever if you're, comfortable with being morally bankrupt.
It was very effective. They also created this false sense of controversy by constantly emphasizing the, supposed debate about the link between smoking and cancer. They'd point to their own flawed research while ignoring the overwhelming consensus among independent scientists.
It's like they were saying, hey, the jury's still out on this, so keep on puffing away.
That's a great way to put it. They were masters of cherry-picking data, highlighting any study, no matter how dubious, that suggested smoking might not be harmful. And they were brilliant at leveraging the reputations of scientists, recruiting respected figures to endorse their claims, even if those scientists weren't, experts in the field.
So it's not just about the facts themselves, it's about who's presenting them and how they're framed, right?
Yeah.
Reputation and authority can really sway people's opinions, even if the underlying evidence is weak.
Absolutely. And the tobacco strategy became a blueprint for other industries looking to downplay risks or manipulate public perception. We see similar tactics used by fossil fuel companies to sow doubt about climate change, for example. It's a playbook that's been used time and again, and it's incredibly effective.
Yeah, it makes you realize that we can't just take information at face value, especially when powerful interests are involved. We need to be aware of these tactics and learn to spot the red flags.
That's where critical thinking comes in. It's about questioning sources, evaluating evidence, and considering different perspectives. It's about being an active participant in the information landscape, not just a passive consumer.
But sometimes, even if we're trying to be critical, it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. Especially with social media, where misinformation spreads so easily and quickly. It's like a virus, infecting our minds and shaping our beliefs.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of understanding how our social networks function. We tend to trust information that comes from people we know and like, even if that information is, false. And when we're constantly exposed to the same ideas and opinions within our, social circles, it can create an echo chamber effect that reinforces those beliefs, making it even harder to change our minds.
Right. It's like we're all trapped in our own filter bubbles, where we only see information that confirms our existing biases.
Yeah.
And that's where things like confirmation bias come into play, right? That tendency to seek out information that supports what we already believe while ignoring evidence that contradicts it.
Exactly. And this bias can be especially strong when it comes to, emotionally charged issues or beliefs that are central to our identity. It's not just about being right or wrong. It's about protecting our sense of self.
So how do we break free from these echo chambers and expose ourselves to different perspectives? It feels like it's getting harder and harder to have civil conversations with people who hold different views, especially online.
It's definitely a challenge, but I think the first step is recognizing that we all have biases and that we're all susceptible to misinformation. None of us are immune. Once we acknowledge that, we can start to be more mindful of the information we consume and the sources we trust.
So it's about developing a healthy skepticism, but not becoming so cynical that we distrust, everything and everyone.
Right. It's about finding that balance between being critical and being open-minded. And it's about being willing to engage in, respectful dialogue with people who hold different views, even if we disagree with them.
But what about those times when people are just plain wrong? Like when they're spreading dangerous conspiracy theories that could harm others? It feels like there's a difference between respecting different opinions and, allowing misinformation to spread unchecked.
That's a really important point. There's definitely a line between healthy debate and the spread of harmful falsehoods, and it's a line we need to be very careful not to cross.
So how do we deal with those situations where people are spreading misinformation that could have real-world consequences? It feels like just ignoring them isn't enough.
You're right. Ignoring it can sometimes make it worse, because it allows those ideas to, fester and grow in the shadows. But directly confronting people who are deeply entrenched in their beliefs can also backfire, making them even more resistant to change.
So it's a delicate balance. We need to find ways to challenge misinformation without alienating people or making them feel like they're, being attacked.
Exactly. And that's where things like empathy and active listening come in. It's about trying to understand where people are coming from, even if we disagree with their conclusions. It's about finding common ground and building bridges instead of walls.
But that can be really hard,
Oh,
especially when we feel like someone's beliefs are completely irrational or even, dangerous.
It is hard, but I think it's important to remember that people's beliefs are often shaped by their experiences, their social networks, and the information they've been exposed to. And sometimes those experiences and influences can lead people down a path of misinformation and conspiracy thinking.
So it's not always about malice or stupidity. It's about understanding the complex factors that contribute to people's beliefs.
Right. And that understanding can help us to approach these conversations with more empathy and compassion, even when we're dealing with beliefs that we find, abhorrent.
So it's not about condoning those beliefs, but about understanding where they come from and trying to find ways to engage in, constructive dialogue.
Exactly. And that dialogue might not always lead to someone changing their mind, but it can at least plant a seed of doubt or help to prevent those beliefs from spreading further.
This conversation is making me realize how much work is involved in being an informed citizen in today's world. It's not just about reading the news or scrolling through social media. It's about actively engaging with information, questioning sources, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
It is work, but it's also incredibly rewarding. The more we understand about how information works, the more empowered we are to make informed decisions and to contribute to a more informed and just society.
Well said. Now let's delve into some specific examples of how these concepts play out in real-world situations. We've talked about the tobacco strategy and its influence on other industries, but what about the role of the media? How do journalistic practices, even those that are well-intentioned, sometimes contribute to the spread of misinformation? We've talked about all the challenges of just navigating the information landscape these days, but I'm curious about the role of the media in all this. We rely on journalists to inform us about what's happening in the world, but they're not infallible, are they?
No, they're not. And even with the best intentions, certain journalistic practices can inadvertently contribute to the spread of misinformation. We touched on this earlier with the fairness doctrine, where the drive to present both sides of a story can backfire when one side is, peddling falsehoods.
Right. It's like giving equal weight to a scientifically sound argument and a baseless conspiracy theory. It creates this false sense of balance and can really mislead the audience.
Exactly. And then there's the novelty bias we discussed, that tendency to gravitate towards sensational or surprising stories, even if they lack, solid evidence.
Yeah, it's the classic man bites dog scenario.
Yeah.
We're wired to pay attention to things that are out of the ordinary. And that can be exploited by those seeking to spread, well, misinformation.
Right, a study that contradicts the prevailing scientific consensus. Well, that's going to get more attention than one that just confirms what we already know. And that can create this distorted perception of the issue, even if the outlier study is later, debunked.
So it's not just about deliberate deception. It's about the subtle ways in which journalistic practices can shape our understanding of the world, even when journalists are, trying to be objective.
Absolutely, and that's why media literacy is so crucial. We need to understand how the news is produced, how stories are framed, and how to critically evaluate the information we're consuming.
So it's about being aware of the potential biases and limitations of any source of information, even those we generally trust.
Right, and it's about being willing to cross-reference information, seek out different perspectives, and, engage in thoughtful discussion with others.
This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener. It makes you realize that misinformation isn't just a problem out there. It's something we encounter every day, in our social networks,
Yeah.
in the media, and even in our own minds.
Yeah, it's a pervasive challenge, and there's no easy solution. But the more we understand about how misinformation spreads, well, the better equipped we are to resist it.
And the more we can contribute to creating a world where truth and accuracy prevail.
Absolutely. It's a fight worth fighting, and it starts with each of us.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of misinformation. We hope it's given you some food for thought and some tools to navigate this increasingly complex information landscape.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, critical thinking, open-mindedness, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Those are our best defenses against the onslaught of misinformation.
That's right. And remember, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And always, always check those sources. Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep exploring